they effectively argued that Germany was, if it reunified, was at risk of becoming a Fourth Reich. Their famous slogan was "Nie wieder Deutschland," never again Germany. So there was something particularly dangerous about Germany, German nationalism, that meant that it couldn't be allowed to exist. They had quite a reactionary streak and were also Islamophobic streak. Started using the term ULTRA-DEUTSCH because ultimately they are ultras, they're like football hooligans for the German national cause.
And you have written a lot about that. Can you explain me a bit, what is this anti-Deutsch movement?
So the anti-Deutsch movement is something that I've covered quite a lot, as you said. They came from the German radical left. I think it's debatable whether they're still left-wing, although for me, it's not really my place to, play this argument of who's left-wing and who's not. But I would say that they have eschewed a lot of typically left-wing causes. They're very much against kind of liberation, like national liberation, except for Israel. I'll give you a little potted history of the anti-Deutsch. Mm-hmm. So they started out during German reunification or just beforehand, and they were radical leftists, kind of from the squat autonomist scene, it was called, kind of anarchists. Mm-hmm. And they effectively argued that Germany was, if it reunified, was at risk of becoming a Fourth Reich. So they were kind of an outgrowth of the 68 movement, but they were very critical of former wings of the radical left for being anti-Semitic from the go. But initially, their main focus wasn't Israel, it was Germany. And they said their famous slogan was "Nie wieder Deutschland," never again Germany. So it's like never again the Holocaust, never again Germany. They had this argument that there was something particularly dangerous about Germany, German nationalism, that meant that it couldn't be allowed to exist in the form of a reunified country again. What happened later on, they had a very they're quite reactionary, as you can probably guess from that. Mm-hmm. Even though it is quite an interesting take and quite a novel political view, they ended up eventually opposing everything Germany was doing. That also meant that they opposed intervention in Bosnia, and certain figures were, almost praising Slobodan Milosevic from Serbia, the Serbian leader who committed, or who was involved in genocide against Bosnians. And they had quite a reactionary streak and were also Islamophobic streak. And that became more and more prominent, but especially took off after 9/11. So after 9/11, they saw Muslims as a danger to the West. And, to me, a lot of their rhetoric sounds like Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. They kind of want to protect liberalism from this authoritarian threat that is radical Islam, or Islamism as they usually call it. But I think it's kind of, they're quite confused and they're quite obsessive, and they seem to interpret everything through German history. So it wouldn't be enough for them to say, Islamism is a conservative force and we should oppose it as progressives. They would then say, for example, that they're the new, like Muslims are the new Nazis, or BDS are the new Nazis, the boycott, divestment and sanction movement to oppose Israel, to boycott Israel. So everything is kind of viewed through the lens of German history. And as Germany has become more pro-Israel in the last 20 years, I think last 10 years especially, I think we've seen a kind of mainstreaming of what was previously a quite radical position of Germany wanting to be on the side of Israel, of opposing all kinds of boycotts as anti-Semitic, of interpreting everything through this lens of like German history, particular interpretations of anti-Semitism as well. So one of the key ideas is that anti-Semitism is not a form of racism, which is quite a bizarre idea, really, because, the Anne Frank Center say anti-Semitism a form of racism against Jews. Ultimately, all forms of racism are complex. I think anti-Semitism, you could say, is a particularly complex one, and it has a lot of history, especially because Jews can look like, European, Middle Eastern, Indian, Chinese even. So ultimately, I would argue, and I have argued, that the anti-Deutsch started out as this kind of radical left-wing phenomenon, but through youth clubs and youth movements, they became more and more influential to the point where almost every center left, every person left of center has kind of imbibed some of the ideas of the anti-Deutsch. And ultimately, they don't oppose anything about Germany anymore because Germany is radically pro-Israel, as are they. And this is why myself, as well as Leandros Fischer, an academic who's written on this topic, have started using the term ultra-Deutsch, because ultimately they are ultras. They're like football hooligans for the German national cause, which in a sense of replacement nationalism, Ersatznationalism, as people call it, is actually standing for Israel. So what we've seen is, and I will actually personally had a lot to do with the anti-Deutsch when I moved here, because I've been interested in the Middle East since I was about 19. I went to Israel for the first time. And then later on, I went to a Jewish friend's wedding there. I went to Palestine. That kind of had some political influence on me. But I will say I've always maintained friends on both sides. Leftist Jews, conservative Zionist Jews, Palestinians. And then I came to Germany and I met people who talked a lot about Israel, but didn't actually have any real knowledge about the conflict or experience. Or they were just, if you talked about Palestinian refugees, they would say, oh, well, Germans had to leave from East Prussia. I don't think they get their land back. So it's this kind of narcissistic German movement, effectively. And just last night, we saw an example of that. There was a Punks Against Anti-Semitism event in Leipzig, and on paper that sounds great. I mean, like, no one should be an anti-Semite, right? But it's almost being against anti-Semitism in Germany has almost become a dog whistle for being anti-Semitic.